Beloved of God, do you believe in miracles? That was not a rhetorical question. We can do better. Do you believe in miracles? Yes. Cool. But I have to admit that if I'm being real honest, I don't actually believe in miracles like this one. At least not in miracles like this in our modern contexts. Maybe they happened 2,000 years ago, but I have a hard time believing that they still happen now. And that's exactly why when I first read this passage of John in preparing for this sermon, my immediate thought was, oh no, I don't want to preach this. I try to be a very logical thinker, and even in matters of faith where we know that our logic and God's logic don't always match, still, I think it's okay to maintain a healthy amount of skepticism and let logic take me as far as it will. But in the spirit of full disclosure, I have to admit that there is another, much more personal reason why I have trouble believing stories about miraculous healings. I tend to be pretty open about my family, so I feel like I have told some of you this before, but for those of you that don't know, my mother lived with a degenerative genetic disability called myotonic dystrophy. It's pretty rare. About 1 in every 8,000 people worldwide are born with some form of myotonic dystrophy. And as my mother got older, she continually lost more and more control over her muscles and the pathways in her nervous system between the brain and these muscles continually got worse and worse. And it's pretty safe to say that in the first century, my mother would have been the type of person to be laying by this pool as the man in our gospel story was today. And even as we watched this condition attack her body, my mother remained a faithful woman her entire life. And she very much did believe in miracles. Even on one weekend, when a tent revival rolled up to our little corner of Appalachia in Elk County, Pennsylvania, we went to this revival called, and I promise you I'm not making this up, it was called the Jesus Power Explosion. And on the Saturday nights of this weekend-long event, and if any of you have been to a tent revival or even just a weekend church camp, you know that Saturday night is when things really go down. That Saturday night, the revival leader shouted through his microphone that he felt the Holy Spirit working in my mother, who just happened to be the only one there in a wheelchair. And so he and a couple of others helped my mother stand up and walk about 20 or 30 feet. Even though at the time, she had not actually lost all control of her muscles. She was still relatively mobile and relatively independent. Although it had been some time since she had tried to walk across a surface that wasn't paved or otherwise conducive to the cane that she usually uses to get around. We had used her wheelchair that day purely out of convenience. And I was maybe 11 or 12 years old at the time, and to be honest, I don't really remember what I was thinking or how I felt at the time. So was it a miracle? Maybe. Did that miracle prevent the continuing degradation of her nervous system and muscles? Or did it prevent her from eventually succumbing to this condition and dying about 13 years later? No. But given all of that, I'm not trying to cast doubt on this story in John's gospel this morning. Rather, I just wanted to illustrate why I still have difficulty with stories like these in the Bible and why I still try to stay away from them. But for the gospel writers and the people in Jesus' world, angels and demons and miracles and healings or as normal and as everyday to them as traffic laws and social etiquette are to us. You don't always see it, and maybe you don't always understand it, but you know it's there. And I have a much easier time thinking about Jesus, the Son of God, performing such miracles than anybody else. But as often true of miracle stories in the Bible, there's another layer to this than simply just being a healing story. We find Jesus encountering a man who had been sick for 38 years. We can assume that in those 38 years, he had done everything he thought possible to be healed, and had now for some time resigned to trying to be the first one into this particular pool in Jerusalem. And Jesus' question to the man could even be taken as an insult. John even lets us know that Jesus had the insight to know exactly how long this man had been suffering, and yet still asks pretty bluntly, "Do you want to be made well?" No. I just couldn't think of anything else to do for the past 40 years. Sometimes I think my sarcasm would have gotten me in trouble with Jesus. But Jesus' question here is still a legitimate one, because sometimes sickness, disability, depression, and other conditions like them can be so overpowering that after a while, it's all we remember. And it's what we're comfortable with, not wanting to face the unknown challenges that being well might bring. And the man that Jesus asks this to responds somewhat sarcastically himself. Of course he wants to be made well, but he goes right into explaining why he has seemingly lost all hope of being healed. In other translations, the story includes an explanation that at the time, many believed that an angel would come and stir the water of this pool, and only the first person into the water after that occurred would be healed. And this man explains that because of his illness, whenever the water is stirred and he tries to stand up and make it in, time and time again, somebody else who is more able-bodied than he is able to get in first, and he's left to try again the next time. And after such a long time, we can imagine that this guy had developed a sort of tunnel vision, not because he became bitter or obsessed in a bad way, but simply because this was the only thing he could imagine that could make him well. In fact, he was there because he maintained a faith in God to heal him. And instead of giving up completely, John implies that had Jesus not come around, he would continue to try to make it into this pool, no matter how long it takes. The problem was not his intent. The problem was not his attitude, but simply a lack of imagination that there could still be another way. And I can tell you from personal experience that this sort of suffering-induced tunnel vision is a very real thing. Sometimes we grow so accustomed to feeling bad or to feeling stuck that we simply forget what it's like to be in a better place. It becomes all we've known for as long as we can remember, and even putting in the effort to get better doesn't always seem to be worth it. Even when it does feel worth it, and when we put all of our energy into getting down into that water after it had been freshly stirred, and it still doesn't work, that can be pretty discouraging. But here, in this story that John is telling us, Jesus is the something that this man could have never have imagined. Unlike other healing stories, Jesus doesn't say anything about his lack of faith, or that all he has to do is just believe. Jesus simply says, "Stand up, take your mat, and walk." And this man, who had been immobile for 38 years, who seemingly never lost faith or hope that he would be healed, only had to encounter Jesus and to have his eyes opened to something that he could have never have conceived before. The Gospels are the story of God doing something that had never been done before through Jesus Christ, who broke religious and worldly laws whenever they got in the way of whatever it was God was doing, even if that meant healing somebody on the day that there was to be no work done. The next part of this gospel story goes into detail about how this man, after being healed, is seen by a group of religious leaders who tell him that it is unlawful for him to be carrying his mat on the Sabbath. And even when this man tells them how he had been miraculously healed and told to pick up his mat and walk, the religious leaders stayed mad that this rule about walking or doing work on the Sabbath is what was broken. They remained hung up on the fact that a rule that they had followed to become close to God was broken to bring this man closer to God. And they didn't really seem to care that such a miraculous healing took place, only that their rules had been violated, and that God showed up in a way that they hadn't expected. And friends, as hard as it can be a lot of the times to hold out hope that God will come when we least expect it, I think that that is really what it means when we say we believe in miracles. Believing in miracles doesn't have to mean that believing that we can pray away someone's cancer or someone's blindness or even someone's heartache. Believing in miracles just means that we choose to hold out hope in what God is doing in our world, even when we can't see that it is happening. Even when we are in a pit of despair that is so dark, we can't imagine a way out. And when we have been in there for so long that the thought of getting out is even more terrifying than staying in, God is preparing a new way out. So, do I believe in miracles? Sometimes. Do I believe in this particular miracle? Yes. Do I believe that all we must do is invoke the name of Jesus for anyone who suffers from a terminal illness to be healed? No. But do I believe that Jesus is still alive and waiting to be encountered in ways we had never expect or imagine? Absolutely. So let me tell you one more story about what it was that brought me back to believing in miracles again. In the summer of 2018, I was fresh out of college, and I was ready and eager to start my master's program at Wesley Theological Seminary. And that summer in between, I wanted to get an introduction to the city that would be my home for the next 3 years. And so I landed a summer job with an organization called Project Transformation DC, where we ran a summer camp for children in wards 7 and 8 of DC, east of the Anacostia River. And I want to be clear, I had nothing to do with what actually happens in this story. I was just trying to survive the first time I had ever worked with children, so. Anyways, the focus of this summer camp was to have these kids who go to school in some of the most underfunded and underserved school districts in the country to retain their reading ability in between school years and prevent the summer slide of going backwards in reading ability. And my job was to be a group leader for some of the older kids in our camp, but it was my friend Jerry's job to oversee the actual reading program. And that summer, there was one particular little girl who had just finished first grade, and was supposed to maintain a second grade reading level throughout the summer. And it didn't take very long for my friend Jerry to figure out that she didn't actually know how to read at all. She had made it through first grade by faking it just enough so that her teachers would let her pass. And so, as you can imagine, this was quite a challenge for my friend Jerry, who was supposed to keep track of not only her reading ability, but the other several dozen kids we had enrolled in this camp. But with all of the gentleness and kindness that I didn't think was possible for one human to have, Jerry sat down with this girl every single day that summer to make sure that she was making progress, building confidence, and actually retaining what it was she learned and not just faking it for him. And let me tell you, on the last day of camp, when Jerry conducted her exit test, because he had waited till the last possible moment to record her final score, this little girl walked away from that camp, not on a first grade reading level, not on a second grade reading level, but on a third grade reading level, and that was a miracle. So, yes, I do believe in miracles. I believe that every time someone finds the courage to speak up against injustice when it is easier to go with the status quo is a miracle. That every time a couple in a tattered relationship decides to continue seeing the good in each other and make things work is a miracle. Or any time someone in a toxic and abusive relationship decides to stick up for their own well-being and leave, that is a miracle. Whenever a young queer person decides to follow God's calling into ministry and dedicate their lives to service in the church, when time and time again the church has shown that maybe they're not the church's highest priority, that is a miracle. Or anytime somebody with depression who has been contemplating suicide decides that maybe life is worth living even just for one more day, that is a miracle. And I'd like to think that each time one of these miracles happens, both the dramatic and not so dramatic alike, that we are given just the smallest glimpse of what John of Patmos described in his revelation of the New Jerusalem. The place where God and humanity and all of creation are finally reconciled and live in perfect harmony. That vision breaks through into our lives every time we choose every time we choose love over hate, or togetherness over division. And friends, I don't want to just paint a rosy picture over these scenarios, because all too often they end in tragedy. And yet, at the same time, when tragedies happen, God is still moving in our midst, showing us glimpses of that vision described in Revelation, and doing so in places that we never imagined possible. May it be so.